Did you know that less than 100 years ago, European women used to wear veils in the same way that Muslims wear hijabs today? In the year 380, the Roman Empire officially adopted Trinitarian Christianity as the official state religion. And with the Roman Empire being the biggest political and military power in Europe at the time, Christianity eventually spread to the rest of Europe, and with it came the Bible. In the first epistle of the Corinthians, one of the books in the New Testament, there's a verse that reads the following: "But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved." Basically, it's saying that women should cover their head, especially when praying, otherwise they might dishonor themselves. And yes, this is in fact an atlas and not a Bible. Anyway, the use of veils go all the way back to the early church being taught universally by the church fathers. Tertullian of Carthage, Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus of Rome, John Chrysostom, Augustine of Hippo, and many others all taught of the importance of veils for women. And this becomes pretty clear when you look at church iconography. If you've ever taken a look at the inside of a church recently, you might have noticed that in all the paintings and glass designs in the windows, the women depicted are usually in veils. And this isn't a unique phenomenon to one denomination of Christianity. I'm talking about Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Protestants who all use the veil in images of female saints or in even Mother Mary herself. And while Christianity has played an extremely influential role in the shared European culture and heritage, someone could make the argument that European history traces its roots well before Christianity, and that Christianity was actually brought from a foreign culture. Therefore, the Christian veil is not actually a European custom, but a foreign custom. I mean, I wouldn't really agree with that, because if I did agree with that argument, the entire video would be pointless. So it turns out that that argument doesn't actually hold water, because Christianity didn't bring the veil to Europe. If we go a little bit further back in time, before Christianity, before even the Roman Empire existed, if we go to the heart of European heritage and tradition, where women first began wearing the veil, we arrive in ancient Greece. In 2003, Lloyd Lewin Jones, a professor of ancient history at Cardiff University in Britain, wrote a book titled Aphrodite's Tortoise. And in this book, he goes into extensive detail on how and why women wore veils in ancient Greece. And as he explains, this was the standard of women's clothing in ancient Greece. The most common style was called the pharos. It was looser and allowed women to move easily while still concealing their bodies. Another style called the lithma was similar, but it was wrapped a bit tighter. Indoors, women would wear the himation, which was an overwrap that would also be tugged up to cover the head when answering the front door in case of male guests. It's kind of like how a lot of Arab women will wear hoodies indoors so that they can just pull it over their hair when they need to answer the door, instead of spending 20 minutes or so getting their hijab done. I couldn't find a picture of it online, but it pretty much looks exactly like this, just without the pot lid face shield. And finally, the one that really surprised me the most was the tegedion, a long rectangular face veil with eye holes that was fastened with a band around the forehead and worn with an overwrap, which is almost exactly the same as the niqab today. Now, if you're coming from this topic from a modern liberal perspective on clothing, you might assume that women in ancient Greece were unhappy with this arrangement. But in reality, from their perspective, the veil was actually a sign of respectability and high status. So much so that it was even illegal for women of lower status, such as prostitutes and female slaves, to wear them. Essentially, for the ancient Greeks, the veil distinguished between women who were protected by the law and by men and their families, and women who were fair game. Side note, in later European societies, this evolved slightly so that unmarried women would go in public without the veil to signify that they were available for marriage. But once they got married, then they would start wearing the veil to show that they were no longer available. And if you're like me, when I first began researching this topic, all of this will come as a complete shock. My whole life I've been told that ancient Greece was all about liberalism and social freedom, and in all the modern art and movies and depictions of ancient Greece, never once have I actually seen a veil. Like, how can this be? The Greeks were wearing hijabs and chadors and niqabs? Are you kidding me? Where was this in history class? Oh, and the author knows this. He had to dedicate the first 5 pages of this book to allay this shock. He explicitly states that the reason more professors aren't writing about this topic and why it's never discussed publicly is because it's too politically sensitive. Well, what do you expect? But you know what's really amazing? The Greeks were just the beginning. After the Romans dominated the Greeks and became the big dogs of Europe, they too brought their own veil culture. Married Roman women wore a simple garment called the stola with a shawl over it that they called the palla. It covered their hair and often their face as well, just the same as the Greeks. Wives were expected to wear the veil outside of the homes, and if a wife went out without a veil, it meant that she was somehow rejecting her marriage or denying her husband. And now she's back on the market. And then there were the religious ceremonies. You had the Vestal Virgins, who were a group of women that tended to Rome's sacred fire and prepared essential materials for sacrifice. They were highly respected and were considered sacred and untouchable. And what symbolized their high status was the special veil worn only by them, called the safibulum. In Roman weddings, on the other hand, the bride's hair was covered with a brightly colored veil called the flammeum. Weddings in Rome were sacred, so if a bride was dressed improperly and wasn't wearing the veil, it was considered an attack on Roman morality. And so, considering how important the veil was already to the Roman and Greek societies, when the Bible came into being with its verses on wearing the veil, it was not a foreign concept at all. European women had been wearing veils for hundreds, if not thousands of years before. It was already a very deeply important part of the European culture. Over the centuries, the style of veils changed significantly. In the late Middle Ages, noble women wore veils like the hennin, which could be divided or truncated. The wimple was also popular in England and France and later evolved into the cornet. During the Renaissance era, noble women began wearing coifs, caps, snoods, hoods, and even hats in place of the veil, but still with the same purpose of covering their hair. And later on, some of these even evolved into the gimpe and the gable hood. Peasants during this time still wore simple linen veils and wraps, and often wore straw hats on top when working outside. In the 1700s, caps started getting fancier, adding laces and feathers. Noble women started wearing the straw hats of peasants, and peasants started wearing the coifs and caps of noble women in this sort of bizarre switcheroo. After the French Revolution, simple was in fashion, and mob caps and head wraps were all the rage. In the 1820s and 30s, caps and bonnets were once again big and fancy. Then caps went out of fashion, bonnets grew smaller, and then in the 1870s, both were replaced by hats. And by the 1900s, the upper class and city dwellers were still wearing hats, but in rural areas, peasants wore scarves and wraps and caps and coifs and veils. I think that was pretty good. That was like 2,000 years of history summarized in what, a minute? There is a clear, uninterrupted history of women feeling the need to cover their hair from the time of the ancient Greeks and potentially even earlier, all the way to the early 1900s. So I don't think when did European women start wearing the veil is the right question. Rather, when did European women stop? In the early 1920s, massive social changes took place. World War I had just ended a few years earlier, migration from rural areas to large cities was increasing exponentially, and the invention and mass marketing of latex condoms all led to what historians call the first sexual revolution. Anything goes became a slogan for the youth, and a new subculture of women was born called flappers. They were women who danced, drank, and smoked, and were career-driven, becoming financially independent and able to live on their own. Chaperones who used to accompany unmarried women in public were no longer important, and traditional clothing fell out of use. Dresses went from floor length to ankle or even knee length, and women began wearing makeup, something that used to be taboo because of its association with prostitution. Veils and hats were no longer used as an indicator of being married or of being high status. They stopped being wardrobe essentials and just became optional accessories, mostly for sunny or cold weather. And this continued into the 1960s, where the more famous sexual revolution happened. The birth control pill had just been invented, and birth control was now as easy as brushing your teeth every morning. And with the addition of abortion becoming legal in many places, premarital sex became the norm. The advent of the internet and modern globalization only further intensified these social revolutions, bringing them even into the rural areas as well. The veil became a relic of the past, an artifact of an era long ago. The old Europe was gone, and in its place was something completely different, and with it, the veil went too.
Well, that's not entirely true.
Veils are actually still quite common in the West. You just may not have noticed them. Now, you remember the flammeum I mentioned before? It was that veil that Roman women used to wear during their weddings. Well, that tradition is still kept today with the bridal veil. In Western Christian culture, the veil has historically been used to symbolize modesty and obedience and chastity, just like back in ancient Rome. And only after the ceremony finishes can the bride's father or groom lift the veil. In contrast to such a joyous event, veils are also worn for the most somber occasion, mourning the death of a loved one. The tradition of widows veiling came from clothes nuns used to wear and became a way to demonstrate sincerity and piety. One of the most famous examples of this was John F. Kennedy's widow, Jackie, who wore a black veil to his funeral. In many rural areas of Europe, older women still wear a traditional veil of some sort, especially in Eastern Europe and in the Mediterranean areas. In Orthodox Christian countries, women are still required to wear a veil when going into churches. I have personally seen this when I traveled to Ukraine and Serbia, but I know it also happens in other countries like Russia and Greece as well. In Catholic countries, on the other hand, women used to be required to wear the veil in church until 1983, when the Vatican passed a new set of laws allowing women to remove their veils. But don't get your hopes up, lady. You still need to wear a veil when visiting the Pope in the Vatican. And then you have Spain, which I know is a Catholic country. But Spain in particular loves veils. Women there wear the mantilla, which is a type of unique veil specific to that region, and women wear it in churches and during Holy Week. Now, I'm not exactly sure what Holy Week is, but they have some really interesting costumes for it. Anabaptist Christians as well are often found in the more sophisticated version of Europe. I'm sure you've heard of the Amish and the Mennonites, but there are other groups as well. And these groups still require women to wear veils at all times, except when alone or at home with their husbands. And since I'm adding examples from the US now, there's a whole hat culture for women in southern states, stemming directly from that verse in the Bible I mentioned earlier. They're called church crowns, and no, they aren't just fancy hats for fashion. They are taken seriously and even have their own set of rules and customs, such as the hat should not be wider than your shoulders or darker than your shoes, and you should never touch another woman's hat unless it's your mother's or grandmother's. And what about the non-Christians of Europe and America? In Jewish law, women are expected to cover their hair when around men who are not in their immediate family. Orthodox Jewish women and some conservative Jewish women as well actually still practice this. On a personal note, I once actually rented an apartment for a month in a Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn, in New York, just south of Williamsburg. I never once saw a woman outside in that neighborhood with her hair uncovered. Never. And if I thought I did, well, look again. She's wearing a wig, so she's not technically breaking the rules. So I covered the bridal and funeral veils, the older women in rural areas, all those Christian sects, the Orthodox Jews, all that stuff in the US, but what am I missing? Oh, the nuns! I bet you that most people who clicked this video were expecting this to be the only thing I talked about and nothing else, which is why I left it for last. For those who don't know, nuns are women who dedicate their lives to religious service in the church. They are found in many countries across Europe and in the US and are usually trusted and well respected by the public. And they all cover their hair with veils both inside and outside the church. And all this leads me to ask the Europeans watching this video, have I given you enough? What more examples do I need to give you? Well, here's one more just for you. The national costume of virtually all your countries incorporates a veil of some kind. This is your heritage, this is your culture, your traditions. Since the beginning of the history of Europe through its Christian past and even until this day, veils have been a part of what makes Europe, Europe. And this video isn't to try and convince you that you should be wearing them. That's a totally different discussion altogether, but rather it's to make you realize that by you attacking women who are wearing veils, you're attacking your own people, your own grandmothers. The 1920s was not that long ago. For some of you, your grandparents lived through that. But who am I to give you a heavy-handed lesson on what's right and wrong? After all, according to most of you, right and wrong, these are just social constructs. They're subjective. But wait, if you don't believe that right and wrong are objective truths, how can you even say that the veil is oppressive or wrong in the first place? If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with all your hijabi friends who are feeling down because of all the slander and harassment they have to put up with on a daily basis. And subscribe if you want more videos about Muslim history and culture from around the world.
I just wanted to share this with you. Queen Elizabeth wearing what we would identify as a hijab, and here are some pictures of her covering her hair, and as many women at the time did, it was the way they dressed. I wanted to share this with you because nowadays this is looked at as oppressive against our culture, but this video will show that within our heritage we have this modest dress, and obviously Queen Elizabeth wearing it, I think, should send a message.